Hello everyone, and welcome to a brand new series from Croydon PIWC entitled The Bible in 52 Weeks. Join us as we journey through the entire Bible and pick out key themes, learn about the background context, and then apply it to our lives. I'll be your host for today, Dorcas Baah. We begin with the first book of the Hebrew Bible, otherwise known as the Torah or Pentateuch, written by Moses. But first, let's go through some vital statistics. The author of Genesis is Moses, and it records God's creation of the world and his desire to have a people set apart to worship him. The book was originally aimed at the people of Israel and was written during Israel's wanderings somewhere in the Sinai Peninsula. The book of Genesis is full of stories we know from Sunday school, like Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark, and Jacob's ladder. This book is a string of epic stories, a semi-tragic saga of a world that just keeps going wrong despite its creator's intentions. Nonetheless, the story of Genesis is really all about setting the stage for the rest of the Pentateuch. It's the long prologue to Israel's beginning as a nation. Specifically, it's the story of the promises God made to humans, promises that God begins to carry out throughout the rest of the Bible. In fact, if the main thrust of Genesis were to be summed up in one verse, it would be these words that God said to Abraham in Genesis 17 verse 7. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. Now, let's take a quick tour of Genesis's foundational themes. The first one being covenant, which is a solemn binding agreement between two or more parties. So covenants usually involve promises, conditions, blessings for keeping the covenant, and curses for breaking it. Genesis has a lot of these agreements, including God's covenant with the post-flood world and his covenants with Abraham. Covenant is what moves the story forward in Genesis. God promised the childless Abram that he will be the father of nations and that his descendants will have a land and that the world will be blessed through them. For 38 of Genesis's 50 chapters, the story follows Abraham's family as God begins fulfilling the first part of that promise. Abraham has 8 children who have children of their own, and so on and so forth. The next 4 books tells the story of how these descendants become a nation and make their move towards claiming their promised land. As you read or study the book of Genesis, pay special attention to any mentions of covenant, promise, and swear, especially when God's the one talking. Now, let's move on to the second theme, blessing. In the 12th chapter, God promises to bless Abraham, bless his allies, curse his enemies, and eventually bless the world through him. This kicks the rest of the book, the rest of the Torah, and indeed the rest of the Bible into gear. From this point on, God has a special relationship with Abraham and his family. The rest of Genesis watches this promise unfold, and it involves a lot of people getting blessed. The narrative of blessings is especially important when we get about halfway through the book, when Jacob inherits, i.e. tricks his dad into giving him the blessing that God had given to Abraham and Isaac. This blessing was originally intended for Jacob's older brother Esau. But before another Cain and Abel situation takes place, Jacob escapes to a distant land where he starts a new life. When Jacob returns, he wrestles with God, who blesses him. As you read and study Genesis, keep an eye on whom blesses whom and what happens when people are blessed. The third important theme in Genesis is the promised land, the land of Canaan. God promises that Abraham's descendants will possess that land in chapter 15, but this promise is not fulfilled until about the book of Joshua. Abraham wanders through Canaan, Isaac settles there, and Jacob eventually settles there too. However, at the end of the book, the budding nation of Israel is dwelling as guests in Egypt. The next 4 books of the Torah tell us how they make their way back to Canaan. As you read and study Genesis, don't just pay attention to what is happening, pay attention to where it's happening. The book of Genesis can generally be broken down into 2 large movements. The first is a story of God's relationship with the world, mainly covered from chapters 1 to 11. So Genesis opens up with God creating the heavens and the earth, the stars, the plants, the animals, and humans, Adam and Eve. God places Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, but they rebel against God, introducing a curse of sin and death into the world. Adam and Eve have children, including Cain and Abel, and those children have children. Eventually, the world becomes so violent that God sent a great flood to destroy the world, but he spares the only righteous man, Noah. Noah built his famous ark to escape the floodwaters with his family and many animals. After the waters recede, God promises to never again destroy the earth with a flood. This movement culminates with the strange story of the Tower of Babel. The people of earth come together to make a great city and a name for themselves. At this time, God and the divine beings with him scatter the people of the earth by confusing their languages and setting up different nations. So the second movement is the origin story of God's relationship with Israel, which is covered from Genesis chapters 12 to 24. Act 1 begins hundreds of years later when God calls Noah's descendants, Abram, to leave his family and journey to the land of Canaan. God promises to bless Abram with many descendants and to bless all the nations of the world through him. Abram believes God's promises, even though he is old and childless. And God considers him to be righteous and changes his name from Abram to Abraham. Later, Abraham has a son, Isaac. Act 2 focuses on Isaac and is covered in Genesis chapters 25 to 27. Isaac dwells in the land of Canaan and has twin sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob grows up, tricks Esau into giving away his blessing, and Esau's not too happy about this. Act 3 depicts Jacob, or Israel, and is covered in Genesis chapters 28 to 36. Jacob then leaves town to live with his uncle. He marries, has 13 children, and lives with his uncle for 20 years before God calls him back to Canaan. As Jacob returns to the land of Abraham and Isaac, his name is changed to Israel. Act 4 focuses on Joseph and is covered in Genesis chapters 37 to 50. Of Jacob's 12 sons and one daughter, Joseph is his favorite. Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery and he becomes a prisoner in Egypt. His God-given ability to interpret dreams becomes valuable to the Pharaoh, however, and so Joseph is released from prison and made second in command of all of Egypt. Joseph warns Pharaoh that a terrible famine is coming and stockpiles food for the coming years. And Joseph's predictions are correct. The famine reaches Canaan and his brothers come to Egypt to buy food. The brothers reconcile and Joseph provides for all the children of Israel to move to Egypt until the famine is over. The book of Genesis ends with the death of Joseph, whose last prediction is that God will bring the children of Israel back to the promised land. So, will God fulfill this promise? If you want to find out, then stay tuned for our next episode of the Bible in 52 weeks as we look at the book of Exodus. Thank you for joining us and see you next week.